Hi folks, welcome back to 3 Minute Tales. This is the She-Bean and I'm your host, Shanna Key. Now unfortunately I haven't been able to upload many videos lately because of all this COVID stuff, but anyway, we're back. And thanks to a couple of comments on our last video about the black and tans, we kind of thought that we might follow on with the Irish kind of thread and explore the Irish famine. This is a story, it's a tragic story, but it's also an uplifting story, so I hope you enjoy it, and please, it's a long one, so hang on until the end. It's very heartwarming, I trust you. So please, if you like the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to leave a comment, you can do so down below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, please do. And don't forget, that notification bell is so important, because if that notification bell is clicked, it means that every time we upload, you're notified. So until the next time, thank you so much for your time. I'm Shanna Key. During the years of 1845 to 1849, millions of people starved to death in Ireland, with a further 1 million people emigrating to escape the country's famine. History books have long claimed that the famine was solely down to crop failure after potato blight ruined the harvest of the farmers' staple food source. However, the reality is somewhat different. Contrary to what historians and orators have claimed, most peasant farmers were far from ignorant and had the wherewithal not to just rely on a single crop to cultivate on their farms. The potato, although a staple food source for many people throughout the island, it was not the only source of nutrition available to the general public. In fact, providing you could afford it, food was available with plentiful supplies of fish, dairy produce, poultry, abundant vegetables, and more importantly grain in the form of wheat, barley and corn. But with Ireland still under the control of the British Empire, and with every acre of land owned and controlled by wealthy British landlords, it meant that every farmer in the country had to pay rent for the land that they farmed. The tenant farmer was effectively an employee of these rich landlords, many of whom did not even reside in Ireland themselves. High rents were paid by the farmers annually, and the tiny profit made on their harvest was subsequently taxed and simply made its way back into the hands of their greedy overlords. For almost all farmers, this agricultural way of life was just a means to an end, and certainly not a profitable business venture. During these years, the British Empire was involved in many conflicts throughout the world, and a decision was made to export most of the grain harvested in Ireland to Britain due to food shortages there. It has been well documented that the senior British civil servant, Sir Charles Trevelyan, who was head of Treasury at the time, believed that the crop was a providential act of God and should be allowed to run its course and take its toll on the people of Ireland. He is quoted as saying, "The greatest evil we have to face is not the physical evil of the famine, but of the moral evil of the selfish, perverse and turbulent character of the Irish people." Harbouring such contempt for the Irish people, it's no surprise that when people actually did begin to starve, he did very little to help them. As more farmers' potato crops failed, they were unable to pay their rents to the landlords, who in turn evicted them from their homes. Hundreds of innocent farmers now found themselves not only homeless, but unable to feed themselves or their families. With tons of Irish meat, butter, vegetables and literally thousands of tons of grain being taken at gunpoint from Irish producers by the British Army and sent back to Britain to feed the struggling empire. One of the first places in Ireland to be hit by the famine was the Dingle Peninsula, where wealthy British landowner Lord Hendry evicted a large number of farmers from their homes due to unpaid rent. One such farmer, Sean Fitzgerald, soon found himself and his family completely destitute. With so many neighbours and friends now in the same situation, Sean had no one to turn to for help. He fashioned a makeshift shelter for his wife Sarah and their 5 children from old canvas sheets in an isolated mountainous area near Brandon Peak. This windswept and remote location was safe, but it was also wide open to the elements. As winter approached, they kept warm by huddling together around a campfire burning wooden tree branches and gorse bushes. Fresh water was plentiful from the many nearby streams, but Sean's endless foraging for food was becoming less and less productive as the weeks went by. Sarah brewed soup from nettles, dock leaves and even grass in an attempt to feed her young family, while Sean caught the occasional fish from the river and picked wild mushrooms to help sustain them in their cold, damp tent. Weakened by hunger, Sean, a man who had never broken the law in his life, decided that more desperate measures were needed to feed his family. On the country estate of Lord Hendry, a severely malnourished Sean stole 2 goats from a paddock and made his way back to his shelter on Brandon Peak. He killed and butchered one of the goats and kept the other goat for its milk. For almost a month, it sustained both him and his entire family, rationing the meat and drinking goat's milk every day. On the morning of December 4th, 1847, as the freezing rain and wind blew in from the Atlantic Ocean, Sean again went against his moral compass and ventured out in search of something to steal to feed his family. Again, on Lord Hendry's land, he furtively entered a wooden chicken coop in an attempt to steal a chicken, but was spotted by one of Lord Hendry's staff. He was immediately apprehended by 2 men and dragged over to the huge imposing country house where Lord Hendry resided. Within an hour, 3 members of the Royal Irish Constabulary arrived at the scene and arrested Sean and brought him to the police station in nearby Dingle. He was detained there for 3 days before a court hearing in front of a Chief Justice, who found him guilty of trespass with intent to steal property from Lord Hendry. Sean was sentenced to 4 years penal servitude in Botany Bay. He was immediately transported by horse and carriage to the port of Queenstown in County Cork to await transport to Australia. Meanwhile, Sarah and her children had become aware that something dreadful had obviously happened to Sean. Not knowing what to do, she eventually abandoned their tiny shelter and along with her young children, they trekked the 5 treacherous miles to Dingle town. In the town, Sarah approached a local priest, Father Daniel Healy, and begged him for some food. The kindly cleric brought both her and her children into the sacristy of the church and fed the 6 Fitzgeralds hot soup and bread. Over 100 miles away in Cork, Sean, along with 107 other men, sat shackled hand and foot in a detention cell awaiting transportation to the penal colony. On basic rations of bread and water, they awaited their fate for a further 2 weeks, before being joined by another 82 prisoners. On the blisteringly cold Christmas Eve of 1847, the men set sail upon a creaking 300-ton prison ship, ironically called the Liberty. It had a crew of 42 on board, and the conditions in the hold of the ship where the prisoners were held was cold, damp and claustrophobic. Each man was chained inside a tiny cell that measured 5 foot 10 inches long, 16 inches wide and 18 inches high, and they spent 23.5 hours of each day there. A 30-minute exercise break on the deck of the ship was the only break that they got from their cramped conditions every afternoon. A menu of bread, water and broth was all the prisoners were given to eat, and before long the health of the already malnourished prisoners began to fail. Within the first 22 days of sailing, a total of 11 prisoners had died from starvation and dysentery. Before the ship sailed into Botany Bay 110 days later, 94 of the 190 prisoners had died. On the 4th of May 1848, weighing just 85 pounds, Sean Fitzpatrick set foot on Australian soil for what would be his home for the next 7 years. The prisoners were quarantined for a further 2 weeks before being transported to work on chain gangs, clearing the way for the construction of new roads and railways. They spent up to 14 hours a day breaking ground under a blisteringly hot sun with heavy pickaxes. Thankfully, the men were reasonably well fed and had an abundant supply of clean water to keep them hydrated. The man in charge of the chain gang was a brutal 42-year-old Welshman called Sergeant William Jenkins. His propensity for cruelty and violence towards the convicts was legendary. He would often use a horsewhip on the bare back of any man he thought was not pulling his weight. Sean did not escape the wrath of Jenkins either, and had been on the receiving end of the horsewhip on many occasions. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, Sean still had trouble sleeping at night with the thought of how his dear wife Sarah and his 5 young children might be coping without him. He had reoccurring nightmares of seeing his family frozen to death under the snow-covered canvas shelter on Brandon Peak. He often cried at night in despair, just thinking about them. After almost 2 years working on the chain gang, Sean and another Irishman called Seamus Kelly was picked to work as labourers alongside a team of stonemasons who were working on the front elevation of St Andrew's Cathedral in nearby Sydney. Still strictly supervised, Sean found his new line of work a welcome release from the labour of the chain gang. The work was extremely taxing, carrying huge blocks of granite to the stonemason's workshop and disposing of tons of stone cuttings and chippings every week. However, after expressing a keen interest in the work of the craftsmen, he was offered an opportunity to study stonemasonry under the tutelage of an Italian master craftsman called Francesco Mancini. Mancini had spotted Sean's talent for engraving and stone carving straight away. For the next 2 years, Sean spent up to 16 hours a day painstakingly learning his craft under Mancini, working countless hours creating the Gothic pillars and vestibule of the cathedral. In June of 1852, Sean was granted his freedom from penal servitude. Now, with an official ticket of leave, Sean could now legally stay and work in the country or choose to return to his homeland. However, without any money, he had to make the heartbreaking decision to remain in Sydney and to continue to work until he had the means to return back to Ireland. It took him another 3 years before he managed to secure a place on a ship to sail back to his homeland. On the 12th of October 1855, Sean sailed into the port of Kinsale aboard the prison ship, the Lassie. Within days, he had made his way back to Dingle. He anxiously attempted to locate his beloved wife and children, but things had changed in the town that he had been exiled from 7 years beforehand. Many of the people who he had known previously had either died, moved on, or emigrated. After 3 days of frantic searching, he eventually happened upon the local priest, Father Healy, who remembered Sarah and the children very well. He explained to Sean that he had secured a place in the workhouse for Sarah and the children, and that they had lived there until the summer of 1850. The priest also revealed the sad news to Sean that 2 of his children had sadly died from TB in the workhouse. Sean was heartbroken, but when Father Healy told him that his young family had emigrated to the United States late in the year of 1850, he was inconsolable. The priest told Sean that Sarah had secured work as a nanny in the New York suburb of Brooklyn Heights. He needed to be reunited with his family, but with little money, he had no physical means to be able to afford the passage to the United States. Desperate measures were now needed once again. On the night of November 4th, 1855, Sean entered Lord Ventry's stately home through an open window in the kitchen of the premises. When inside, Sean helped himself to every bit of silverware that he could find. Ornate candlesticks, cutlery, silver ladles, knives, and even a large silver carriage clock were carefully packed inside a heavy canvas sack before Sean fled the mansion with his loot. It took a further 10 days before Sean eventually made his way to Limerick City, 90 miles away. In a shady back street tavern, Sean negotiated the sale of his ill-gotten gains for the princely sum of £100, which was more than enough to pay for his passage to the United States. It took another 6 weeks before Sean paid for and boarded a merchant ship sailing from Galway City to New York. After a journey of almost 6 weeks, the cargo ship sailed into New York Harbour. After docking, Sean waited until nightfall before jumping ship. Within an hour, he found himself in New York City. The following day, on the corner of Church Street in Manhattan, Sean entered St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church, where he found an elderly Italian priest. He explained his situation to Father Rubio and asked him for help in finding his wife Sarah and his children. With the assistance of Father Rubio and 2 young altar boys, Sarah Fitzgerald and her 3 children were located and brought to the church, where Sean patiently waited for them. On seeing Sean for the first time in almost 8 years, Sarah fainted with shock. She had never known what had happened to her husband and presumed that he was dead. Sean passionately embraced all 4 of them, and with tears of joy in his eyes, he vowed he would never ever leave them again. Sean, Sarah and his 3 children eventually settled in the small suburb of Vinegar Hill in Brooklyn, where they lived happily for over 40 years. As a pillar of the local community, he went on to secure work as head stonemason on the construction of the famous St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, and his craftsmanship still holds pride of place at the front of the magnificent building. Both Sean and Sarah Fitzgerald amazingly lived well into their 80s and are buried side by side in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery.